Thank you, Julia, and no worries. I can basically say all of that because everything that you guys have mentioned is somewhat also contained in what I wanted to briefly share. So I teach in MAFT. I'm professor of mechanics and materials, where I teach large and small classes. One of the specialties that we had is I normally teach on the board, the big classes. I really have a blackboard and I teach 4 hours a week. MAFT had a special rule last semester that from day one in these classes, we had no students. So from, September 20 or something, I was standing in front of a completely empty room just with a cameraman. And I'll get back to the challenge by itself, but that really, came with certain challenges. What I do is I teach different things, and I've really been going through the entire circus of what you can do with virtual teaching. So right now, for example, I'm teaching in parallel 2 virtual small classes with 70 or 20 students, and those are run with Zoom, sorry. And with Zoom, it's relatively easy because I can use native Zoom tools like the chat function for asking questions, the audio feedback. I use polls quite a bit because you can have instant feedback on Zoom as well. And we use Moodle, of course, for everything else, but that's offline. And then every year in the fall, and this will come up this year again, I teach dynamics, which is a large mandatory course for all BAUK and MAFT students. It's usually on the order of 550 to 600 students. I teach 4 hours a week, and then we also have small exercise sessions. And so most of the interactive interaction in terms of peer discussions and so forth, this goes into our small exercise sessions. And I usually really teach 4 hours a week. And here we rely on the Edu app, and this is what I'll primarily talk about briefly. And so we use two things, both have been pointed out so far. Of course, the issue is if you have a completely empty room, except for a poor cameraman who's looking at you for 4 hours a week, then you have to somehow get feedback, be it direct or indirect. Anything that comes from the students has to be channeled somehow. And of course, we use the course channel. We used it a lot for answering questions. I usually had an assistant sitting in the room with me. And for all minor questions, he or she will just respond in writing. So we have many questions where it says, why is this? And it's a simple question the assistant can answer. Why are we missing something? The assistant can answer. But of course, if there are major things or also typos, student often spot a typo on the board or things like this, then I ask the assistant to escalate it. So, they would alert me that, hey, there's an issue, or 2 or 3 students are asking the same question. Can you comment on that? And then, of course, I would explain. And one of the things that's special about us is that I don't imagine this to go away after COVID, because one of the issues we have is I teach for 2 different departments, which means we actually have a live broadcast to Hunk. So I'm standing in MLD 28, but we have a live broadcast through the ETH video streaming to Hunk, and about 200 students or so will be sitting in the room on Hunk while I'm teaching in the center. And because of that, those poor 200 fellows who are sitting on Hunk have no chance to ask questions, but to use something like the Edu app channel. So we will have to continue using that, even with students back in the rooms, hopefully sooner than later. And then the second point, of course, is the clicker questions, and I use that extensively. And so let me just give you a few examples of what we do. I do ask both quantitative and qualitative examples. Here's a simple one. In some week I explain angular momentum and what happens, if you have a heavy weight hanging on a rope on a certain body, and the question is, what's the acceleration downwards? And usually I aim for at least 1 clicker question per 45 minutes. Sometimes it's more. I teach twice 90 minutes. That's about 4 or 5 or 6 questions per week. And as was pointed out before, one should never underestimate the timing. I usually take about at least 1 minute to read the question and explain any concepts. I usually give them 2 to 3 minutes. With the latency in the video broadcast, it's usually even a minute more to answer. And then, of course, I also need time to explain the correct answer or to comment on any issues that came up. But the nice thing is, over the years, you can generate and also recycle a pool of questions. You can easily, take questions from previous years. And by doing that, it's very easy to generate a long list of questions you can pick from, and you can also alternate. Why do I use Clicker? These questions, these points have been brought up before. Point number 1 is to check student intuition before you dive into an actual experiment or a solution. I also show experiments in class. So you might go and say, before I now run this experiment, let's think about what will happen. And I want you to think about it and to answer. In this case, no calculation necessary. Just carefully thinking about the concepts and gaining intuition for what's going to happen. So in this case, I was sitting on a rotating chair, holding a rotating object, and then by angular momentum balance, the students have to guess if I turn right, turn left, fall over, or whatnot. You can use the same also, of course, to check their methodological skills. Here's an example problem. It's great always to say this is a typical exam problem, then they're very eager to solve it. I give you 2 minutes, go ahead and try to solve it. Checking student understanding if they can transfer concepts. So now that we've solved this problem, let's try what happens if we change it in the following way, and then let them answer. One thing I like to do is prompt student reflection by giving them incorrect but seemingly correct answers. So every now and then I have clicker questions where one of the answers looks like this is the perfect answer and 90% click them, but that's the wrong answer. And that's great because then you can go in and say, oh no, you all got it wrong, I'm so sorry. Of course, that's fake. But then, you go on, let's understand why this is wrong. And it really gives motivation to the students. They want to find out why they clicked the wrong thing. And then, of course, you have motivation for the next 20 minutes again, and they have to reflect on what was wrong. And of course, it's also great to give us feedback on the lecture pace, as was mentioned by several folks before. It's great to see if they're following or not, or even how many are responding. That's another indication. I find it quite interesting. Sometimes the first question, you only have 70 people who answer, and you're like, oh my goodness, who's actually watching? But then you ask a second question, and all of a sudden you have 260 responses. And it tells you a lot about if students are following and if they understand the concepts you're asking. I have a lot of qualitative examples too, like I said, where you don't really have to calculate, you just look at pictures and you carefully think about it. And in these two examples, at times I'm thinking, are these too simple, right? If you see that here, whatever 80, 90% get the answers right, maybe, but I think it's important to carefully think about what's the right balance. And so with these questions, I would always try to strike the right balance. If a question is too simple or too hard, it's bad because it gives the wrong expectations to the students. I find they will think, all the problems are so easy. That means the course is easy. I don't have to study hard. The exam is going to be easy and so forth. Especially in this case, our exam also includes multiple choice questions. So really try to make the clickers so they look like actual exam questions. And then you have to gauge the right level of difficulty. You don't want to bore the students, but of course, if it's too hard, they're not going to participate either. So it's the right balance, I think, is great. Sometimes having a simple question is fantastic too, because it gives the students a sense of success. So it's a moral uplift. Yes, I got it right. I understood something. If they always click the wrong answer, that's very decisive in terms of the morale. But of course, you also have to challenge the students. So I would always try to strike the right balance between simple ones and harder ones. One thing from my experience, but I think it was also mentioned before, is one should carefully think about the timing of clicker questions in an actual lecture. Of course, we do a flipped classroom and you have many clicker questions, that's a different thing. But if you integrate them into 90 minutes of classical lecturing, then I think there are good and bad times to ask a question. For me, a great one is either at the beginning, I go in and I say, last time we discussed this, let's recap and see if we all remember what we talked about last week. Is great before the 15-minute break in between. I usually end 3 minutes early and say, now we end a bit early, but here's a question I really want you to think about. And then, I explain it, I leave the time, and I leave it open over the break. And I come back after 15 minutes, and usually you can very nicely see how the number of responses is increasing almost continuously over the 15-minute break. And after the break is also a great one to refresh the students. You come back and, now in the first hour we talked about this and this. Now, here's a question. Let's see if we understood what we just did. And then you continue. You can also use it to motivate the next topic to talk about. From my experience, bad times to ask a clicker are in the middle of a lengthy discussion because it's really disruptive. Like many of us were saying, it takes 5-6 minutes to load the thing, to have the students answer, grab their cell phones, do all kinds of things. So I would never start a topic then, let's do a quick clicker, and then let's get back to the board and remember what we did before. It can be very disruptive. I would also never ask a question at the end of class. I've done it a few times, but it's disastrous because if you say, I'm going to end 3 minutes early, but I want you to answer this question, the moment you finished your sentence, they're out the room or virtually out the room and they would not respond. That was my experience. One thing I don't want to hide, and I'm sorry for those who work on the Edu app, like many said, of course, it has proved a lot over the years. But there are, of course, still some glitches. This is just one example from a lecture I gave in December where over 3 minutes, I don't know how many dozens of students were complaining that, the Edu app is slow, it's not loading, it's very laggy right now, I cannot respond and whatnot. One thing we realized is that the web browser version is a lot more stable than the cell phone app for whatever reasons. So when the students choose the web browser, it works magically. The cell phone app, for some reason, seems to have gigantic delays at times. And then there's the other issue that was brought up before, which is the latency of the ETH video stream, which I think is really a major challenge. If you have to wait, 30, 40, 50 seconds between the students even hearing you reading the answer, then responding. And in these cases, what I did, because I had all students remote, I would even start explaining the answer before closing the clicker, because I knew that they could respond for another 30 seconds or 40 seconds or whatever it is. So I could play with this time. But it's really not ideal. So I would hope that this can be brought down in the future too. And so, using clicker is great, but of course, it's also a source of technical difficulty at times. And the last slide I have here, so over the years, we generate a nice pool of questions, and every class I try to have 2 or 3 questions or something like that. Last year, when I taught dynamics in the break at the end, I actually did a quick statistics to see how many students respond. And so I have about 540, 550 students. And this is the response, or this is the number of students who responded during each class, because there are different number of clickers. For every class, I have a max and a min. And so the max is the maximum number of students who responded to any of the clicker questions during that class, and the min is the minimum number of students. And it's quite interesting because there is a tiny trend downwards, except for the Christmas lecture where I do something special, and I also talk about the exam, so they all come back, of course. But in general, there's a slight downward trend during the semester, almost 300 in the first week, but then it gradually decreases. But one of the interesting things one can see here is that it really depends on the questions. So this here, for example, is a typical example where if I ask the blue question first, I'm really down because only 100 students respond, but then you ask the second question, out of a sudden you see 230 or something are responding. So it very much depends on the question that one is asking. The one thing that made me very happy is that on average, there's still a very large number. So this is a 3rd semester course across two departments, and still at least having something on the order of 180 to 200 follow live is great. It also gives you a sense of who's actually there. And then I also try to make a correlation whenever I ask more than one question, if there is any correlation. And it's interesting because it's inconclusive. In the first half of the semester, it almost always looks like the first question has more responses than the second one. So it always goes down within an individual lecture, even with 3 questions. But then towards the end, you see the opposite trend for some reason. First question, second question, first, second, first, second, first, second. I don't know if this is a general trend, meaning that those students are really good. They're the ones who stick to it, and they may get better over the semester, or if it's just coincidence. But that's what I saw during last year. So the bottom line is, I think the clicker questions are great. They require a small bit of practice and effort, but they're a very helpful tool, no matter if it's flipped or classical classroom teaching. And I can also tell the same as was pointed out before. So on the LET student evaluation I got for the class, many students put in explicit comments that the clicker question was a very positive feature of the learning experience. They liked it. And I cannot remember ever having received a single comment saying, please get rid of the clicker questions. The students do like those because they help and support in teaching. And that's all I want to share. Thank you.